Sarah looked like any tired passenger sleeping in seat 7C. Nobody knew she was a fighter pilot with 8,000 flight hours until the captain's desperate voice echoed through the cabin. Can anyone fly this plane? The ordinary woman who just wanted to nap had suddenly become everyone's only hope for survival. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Also like and subscribe for more stories like this. The busy airport terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to catch their flights. Among them walked Sarah Chin, a 35-year-old woman dressed in simple jeans and a sweater. She looked no different from thousands of other tired passengers. Carrying only a small backpack, she had dark circles under her eyes from sheer exhaustion. Nothing in her appearance suggested she was anything more than an ordinary traveler heading home after a long business trip. Sarah found her seat 7C, the dreaded middle seat between a businessman frantically typing on his laptop and an elderly woman already settled in with her knitting. The businessman glanced at her as she sat down, noticing her tired expression. "Long day?" he asked politely. "Very long," Sarah replied with a yawn. "I just want to sleep." She immediately closed her eyes and settled into her seat. The businessman shrugged and returned to his work, assuming she was probably some office worker who had pulled an all-nighter. The elderly woman smiled sympathetically, remembering her own exhausting travel days. Neither of them had any idea that the seemingly ordinary woman between them was actually Captain Sarah Chin, a former Air Force pilot with over 8,000 flight hours and extensive emergency training. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Flight attendant Jenny walked through the cabin conducting the safety demonstration. She noticed Sarah already dozing peacefully and made sure to speak in hushed tones when passing her row. "Poor thing probably worked all night," Jenny whispered to another flight attendant. "Let's try not to wake her during service." The Boeing 737 lifted off smoothly from Denver International Airport. Beginning what should have been a routine 6-hour flight to Boston, Sarah slept deeply as the Rocky Mountains faded below the clouds. She had specifically chosen this flight because she wanted uninterrupted rest. After months of intense flight training schedules and certification renewals, she desperately needed a break from anything aviation related. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin was peaceful. Passengers read books, watched movies on their tablets, or dozed like Sarah. Jenny quietly served drinks, carefully stepping around sleeping passengers. The businessman beside Sarah had ordered coffee and was deep in spreadsheets. The elderly woman was making good progress on what looked like a baby blanket. "She hasn't moved once," the elderly woman whispered to the businessman, glancing at Sarah. "Must be absolutely exhausted, probably some office worker catching up on sleep," he whispered back, not wanting to disturb their sleeping neighbor. Sarah's breathing was deep and steady, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. Her face showed no tension, no worry, just the calm expression of someone finally getting the rest they desperately needed. No one in the cabin suspected that this tired-looking woman had landed fighter jets on aircraft carriers, navigated through severe storms, and handled more aviation emergencies than most commercial pilots see in their entire careers. In the cockpit, Captain Mike Torres and First Officer David Kim were enjoying what seemed like a perfect flight. The 52-year-old captain had over 20 years of commercial flying experience, while his 29-year-old first officer was sharp and eager. Their instruments showed normal readings across the board. "Beautiful day for flying," Captain Torres said, scanning the clear blue sky ahead. "Should be smooth sailing all the way to Boston." "Weather reports show clear skies for the next 4 hours," First Officer Kim confirmed, making routine notes in the flight log. Couldn't ask for better conditions. Neither pilot knew that in exactly 18 minutes, their perfect flight would become a nightmare that would test every skill they possessed and require help from the most unexpected source. The first sign of trouble came as a barely noticeable vibration through the airframe. Captain Torres frowned and glanced at his instruments, but everything still appeared normal. First Officer Kim felt it too, just a slight tremor that could have been normal turbulence. "Did you feel that?" Torres asked. "Yeah, probably just hit a small air pocket," Kim replied, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Then the master caution light illuminated, followed immediately by multiple warning chimes that sent both pilots into high alert. The aircraft's central computer system was detecting problems faster than the crew could process them. "Engine is showing abnormal readings," Kim called out, his training kicking in as he began running through emergency checklists. But this wasn't a simple engine problem. Within seconds, the hydraulic pressure warning light joined the growing collection of red indicators on their panel. Then the electrical system warning, then pressurization alerts. "This doesn't make sense," Torres said, his experienced eyes scanning instruments that were telling him multiple critical systems were failing simultaneously. These systems are independent. They shouldn't all fail at once. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice something was wrong. The aircraft's smooth flight had become noticeably rougher, and sensitive travelers could feel the subtle changes in engine sound and aircraft attitude. Sarah remained deeply asleep, her body naturally adjusting to the slight turbulence without waking her conscious mind. The businessman beside her saved his work and closed his laptop. Sensing that the smooth flight was ending, the elderly woman looked up from her knitting with concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked Jenny as the flight attendant passed by. Jenny's forced smile couldn't hide her growing worry. "Just a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about," she replied automatically, though the unusual pattern of chimes from the cockpit was making her increasingly nervous. In the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as isolated system warnings was cascading into a full emergency. The aircraft's fly-by-wire computer system, which normally assisted pilots with flight control, was providing contradictory information. "I'm getting false readings on everything," First Officer Kim reported, his voice tight with stress. "Altitude shows we're climbing and descending at the same time. Airspeed indicators don't match." Captain Torres fought to maintain control as the aircraft became increasingly difficult to handle. 23 years of flying experience told him this wasn't normal mechanical failure. This was something far worse. "Dave, I think we've got a major computer malfunction," he said grimly. "The whole flight management system might be compromised." The aircraft suddenly lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seat belts. Overhead bins rattled, and several people cried out in alarm. The businessman grabbed his armrests while the elderly woman clutched her knitting needles. But Sarah still slept, her subconscious mind so accustomed to aircraft movement that even this dramatic motion registered only as a slight disturbance in her dreams. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," Torres announced over the intercom, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos in the cockpit. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." The understatement of the century, Kim thought grimly as he watched more warning lights illuminate their panel. Like a deadly Christmas tree, Jenny and the other flight attendants moved quickly through the cabin, ensuring passengers were secured and trying to project calm professionalism, while their own hearts raced with fear. They had never seen this many warning lights in the cockpit during their pre-flight safety briefings. "What kind of technical difficulties?" the businessman asked Jenny as she checked his seatbelt. "I'm sure the pilots have everything under control," Jenny replied, though her worried expression suggested otherwise. The aircraft lurched again, this time dropping suddenly before recovering. Several passengers screamed, coffee cups flew through the air, and a baby started crying somewhere near the front of the plane. Sarah's eyes fluttered, but didn't open. Some deep part of her pilot's mind recognized the aircraft's distress, but her exhausted body refused to fully wake up. In the cockpit, Captain Torres was fighting the aircraft with everything he had. The primary flight display was showing impossible readings. They were apparently flying upside down at 45,000 feet, while simultaneously descending through 15,000 feet at 300 miles per hour. "The backup instruments aren't matching either," Kim reported desperately. "I can't tell what's real anymore." Torres looked out the window and used the most basic piloting skill, visual reference to the horizon. They were flying level at approximately 35,000 feet, but their instruments insisted they were in a steep dive. "We're flying manually from here on," he decided. "Disconnect the autopilot and flight management system completely." But as Kim reached for the autopilot disconnect, the aircraft's nose suddenly pitched down violently. Both pilots pulled back on their controls, but the computer system was fighting them, trying to correct for problems that didn't actually exist. "I can't control it," Torres shouted over the screaming of the overstressed airframe. "The computer won't let me fly." The aircraft entered a steep dive that threw passengers forward against their seat belts. Oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling, as the cabin pressure system, also controlled by the malfunctioning computer, began venting precious breathable air into the thin atmosphere outside. Screams filled the cabin. Parents grabbed their children. The elderly woman began praying quietly, while fumbling with her oxygen mask, and finally the chaos was enough to wake Sarah Chin. Her eyes snapped open, not gradually like someone waking from normal sleep, but instantly alert in the way that only comes from years of military training. Her pilot's mind immediately processed multiple inputs: the aircraft's attitude, the sound of the engines, the screaming passengers, the deployed oxygen masks. "Oh God," she whispered, recognizing the signs of a catastrophic emergency. She grabbed her oxygen mask with one practice motion while her eyes scanned the cabin. The flight attendants were struggling to help passengers. While fighting the aircraft's violent movements, through her window, she could see the ground getting closer at an alarming rate. Her pilot training kicked in automatically, even before fully waking up. She was calculating airspeed, rate of descent, and estimated time until ground impact based on visual references. The numbers weren't good. Then she heard Captain Torres' voice over the intercom. Filled with a desperation she had never heard in 20 years of aviation, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency. Our flight computers have malfunctioned, and I'm having difficulty controlling the aircraft. If there is anyone on board with pilot training, any kind of pilot training, please identify yourself too." The flight attendants immediately, "We need help." The cabin fell silent except for the roar of overstressed engines and the whistle of air rushing past the aircraft. Passengers looked around at each other with wide, terrified eyes. Who among them could possibly help fly a commercial airliner? Sarah's mind raced. She was deadheading traveling as a passenger while off duty. Technically, she had no authority to enter the cockpit, but she also had more emergency experience than probably any other pilot. Flying commercial routes today. The businessman beside her was staring at the oxygen mask instructions with panic in his eyes. The elderly woman was crying quietly, clutching her knitting like a lifeline. "Mom, can you help us?" Jenny appeared beside Sarah's row, her professional composure cracking. "The captain needs someone with flying experience." Sarah looked around the cabin one more time. Terrified faces stared back at her, children crying, adults praying, everyone depending on Captain Torres to save them. But she could hear in his voice that he was reaching the limits of what he could handle alone. She unbuckled her seat belt and stood up, surprising everyone around her with her sudden calm authority. "I'm Captain Sarah Chin, Air Force Reserve. Commercial rated," she announced clearly. "Tell your captain I'm coming forward." The businessman's jaw dropped. "You're a pilot?" "Fighter jets, cargo planes, and commercial aircraft," Sarah replied, already moving toward the cockpit with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. 8,000 flight hours, including about a dozen emergencies worse than this one. Jenny's relief was visible as she escorted Sarah forward. "Thank God. The captain will be so glad to see you." As they moved through the cabin, passengers watched with new hope. The tired woman from 7C, who had seemed like just another exhausted traveler, was actually their best chance of survival. Sarah's mind was already shifting into emergency mode. The transition from peaceful sleep to life-threatening crisis was jarring, but her training helped her push through the disorientation. She could feel adrenaline clearing away the last traces of sleepiness. At the cockpit door, Jenny knocked urgently. "Captain Torres, we have a pilot passenger coming forward." The door opened immediately, revealing Captain Torres' sweat-covered face. Behind him, she could see First Officer Kim wrestling with controls, while red warning lights painted the cockpit. "Like a scene from hell. Thank God," Torres said, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. "I'm Mike Torres. This is Dave Kim. We've got multiple system failures, and the flight computers are giving us false information." Sarah quickly scanned the cockpit, her experienced eyes taking in the chaos of warning lights and contradictory instrument readings. But she also noticed something the two pilots focused on their instruments had missed. "Captain, look outside," she said calmly. Visual reference. "We're actually in controlled flight at approximately 30 for 1,000 feet, wings level." Torres looked up from his instruments and felt some of his panic recede. She was right. Despite what their computers were telling them, the aircraft was flying normally. "The computer system is lying to you," Sarah continued. "Classic cascading failure in the flight management system. I've seen this twice before, once in an AC-130 over Afghanistan, once in a simulator. Can you help us?" Kim asked desperately. Sarah was already settling into the jump seat behind the pilots. "First, we isolate the malfunctioning system. Dave, can you pull the circuit breaker for the primary flight computer?" "But that will disable our autopilot and navigation," Kim protested. "Your autopilot is trying to kill you right now," Sarah replied firmly. "Pull it." Kim looked at Captain Torres, who nodded grimly. The moment the circuit breaker was pulled, the aircraft's violent movements calmed significantly. "Better?" Sarah asked. "Much better," Torres admitted. "But now we're flying completely manual with no computer assistance." "That's fine," Sarah said. "Pilots flew airliners manually for decades before computers." "Mike, can you maintain heading and altitude while Dave and I work on getting backup systems online?" For the first time since the emergency began, Captain Torres felt like they might actually survive this. The calm confidence of the woman behind him was exactly what his panicked crew needed. "Sarah, how do we explain this to the passengers?" he asked. "They're terrified back there." Sarah considered this. She knew that passenger psychology during emergencies was just as important as technical skills. People needed hope, but they also needed honesty. "Tell them we've identified the problem and we're working on solutions," she advised. "Don't lie to them, but give them something to hold on to." Torres keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain with an update. We've identified the source of our technical problems, and we have an experienced pilot passenger assisting us in the cockpit. We're working to resolve the situation and will update you shortly." In the cabin, the passengers felt a collective sigh of relief. The pilot passenger Sarah from 7C was helping. Maybe they had a chance after all, but Sarah knew their problems were far from over. Without computer assistance, landing a modern airliner required precise coordination between multiple crew members. As she could see on the fuel gauges that they were burning fuel faster than normal due to the system malfunctions. "Dave, what's our fuel situation?" she asked. Kim checked his calculations. "At current consumption rate, we have about 2 hours before we reach minimum reserves. And Boston is still 90 minutes away under normal conditions," Torres added grimly. Sarah processed this information. Flying manually in emergency conditions would consume even more fuel. They needed to find an airport closer than Boston, and they needed to prepare for a very challenging approach and landing. "Mike, what's the nearest suitable airport?" she asked. Torres consulted his charts. "Cleveland Hopkins big runway, full emergency services, about 40 minutes away." "That's our best option," Sarah agreed. "Dave, can you contact air traffic control and declare a full emergency? Tell them we need priority routing to Cleveland and emergency vehicles standing by." As Kim worked the radio, Sarah's mind was already several steps ahead, planning their approach to Cleveland. She knew that landing without computer assistance would require old-school piloting skills that many modern pilots rarely practiced. "Mike, when was the last time you flew a completely manual approach?" she asked. Torres thought for a moment. "Probably 5 years ago during recurrent training." "Maybe 3 years, Kim admitted. Sarah nodded. This was going to be challenging, but not impossible. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'll talk you through a manual approach. We'll use visual references and basic instruments only, no computer assistance, no auto system." She could see doubt in both pilots' eyes. Landing a commercial airliner manually was like performing surgery with boxing gloves, technically possible, but requiring enormous skill and precision. "Have you done this before?" Torres asked. "Dozens of times," Sarah replied confidently, "in much worse conditions than this. Combat landings on damaged runways, not approaches with no instrument landing systems. Emergency landings on aircraft carriers. This is going to feel easy compared to landing an F-18 on a pitching deck in a thunderstorm." Her confidence was infectious. Both men felt their anxiety decrease as Sarah took charge of the situation with a calm authority that comes only from extensive emergency experience. "First, we need to brief the cabin crew," Sarah continued. "They need to prepare passengers for an emergency landing. Assume we might have to evacuate quickly." Torres called Jenny to the cockpit and explained the situation. Sarah watched the flight attendant's face carefully, seeing fear, but also determination. "Jenny, you and your crew are the most important people on this aircraft right now," Sarah told her. "The passengers are going to take their cues from you. If you stay calm and confident, they will too." "What should we tell them?" Jenny asked. "The truth, but not all at once," Sarah advised. "Tell them we're diverting to Cleveland as a precaution, that we have everything under control, and that they should review their safety cards and listen carefully to instructions." As Jenny returned to the cabin, Sarah turned her attention back to the immediate flying challenges. They were beginning their descent toward Cleveland, and every decision from here on would be critical. "Mike, reduce power slowly and begin a gentle descent," she instructed. "We want to be at 10,000 feet by the time we reach Cleveland's airspace." Torres followed her guidance, feeling the aircraft respond smoothly without the computer systems fighting his inputs. For the first time in an hour, flying felt natural again. "Dave, what's Cleveland Tower saying about weather?" "Winds from the west at 15 knots, visibility 10 miles, scattered clouds at 3,000 feet, Kim reported. "Perfect conditions for a visual approach," Sarah said with satisfaction. "This is actually going to work." But as they continued their descent, Sarah noticed something troubling on the fuel gauges. Their consumption was still higher than normal, and the numbers were getting uncomfortably low. "Mike, I need you to lean the fuel mixture as much as possible without compromising engine performance, she said. We're cutting this closer than I'd like. Torres adjusted the fuel controls while Sarah calculated and recalculated their remaining flight time. They would make it to Cleveland, but with very little margin for error. 20 minutes later, Cleveland's airport came into view through the cockpit windows. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as they approached the critical phase of flight to landing. Okay, gentlemen, this is where it gets interesting, she announced. Mike, I want you to configure for landing exactly as I tell you. Dave, call out our altitude and airspeed every 10 seconds. The next 15 minutes would determine whether 247 people lived or died, and it would all come down to the skills of 3 pilots working together, 2 who were good at their jobs, and 1 who happened to be dozing in seat 7C when the crisis began. Cleveland Tower, this is United 847 declaring emergency, Kim transmitted. We have multiple system failures and are requesting priority approach to runway 24, United 847. Cleveland Tower, emergency vehicles are standing by. You are cleared for straighten approach runway 24. Report. When you have the runway in sight, Sarah looked ahead and could see the runway clearly. After thousands of landings in everything from fighter jets to cargo planes, this felt like coming home. Mike, reduce power and lower the landing gear, she instructed. Dave, give me flaps 15. The aircraft slowed and configured for landing exactly as it should. Sarah watched the airspeed indicator and glide path, making small corrections through her verbal instructions to Torres. Looking good, Mike. A little more power. Dave, full flaps. The runway grew larger in the windscreen. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the taxiway, fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment all waiting for them. 200 feet. Kim called out. Airspeed 145 knots. Perfect. Sarah said, Mike, ease back on the power. Let her settle. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold exactly on target. Torres felt the satisfaction of a perfect approach as the wheels touched down smoothly on Cleveland's runway. Beautiful landing, Mike, Sarah said with genuine admiration. You could be proud of that one. As the aircraft rolled out and came to a stop, the cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers hugged each other, crying with relief. They were alive. They were safe. And it was largely thanks to the tired woman from seat 7C, who had transformed from sleeping passenger to life-saving pilot in the span of 2 hours. Torres turned to Sarah with deep gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. You saved all our lives. Sarah smiled, feeling the exhaustion return now that the crisis was over. Just doing what any pilot would do. We look out for each other up here. As emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and passengers began the evacuation process, Sarah realized she had gone from wanting to avoid anything aviation related to being at the center of one of the most challenging flights of her career. The businessman from seat 7B approached her as they waited to disembark. I can't believe you're a pilot. You seem so ordinary. Sarah laughed. That's the point. We're just regular people who happen to know how to fly planes. Today, I got to use those skills to help. Later, as reporters gathered to interview the heroes of Flight 847, Sarah deflected most of the attention to Captain Torres and First Officer Kim. But she couldn't escape the fundamental truth of what had happened. Sometimes the most important moments in life come when we least expect them. Sometimes heroes are found dozing peacefully in middle seats, wearing jeans and carrying backpacks, looking like anyone else. And sometimes when desperate voices ask, can anyone fly this plane? The answer comes from the most unlikely places. Sarah Chin had boarded Flight 847 as a tired passenger seeking rest. She had landed as the pilot who helped save 247 lives. It was a transformation that took place not over years of training, but in the crucial minutes when expertise met emergency, and ordinary people rose to do extraordinary things. As she finally walked through Cleveland's terminal, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had wanted to avoid aviation conversations and just sleep peacefully. Instead, she had been part of one of the most memorable flights of her career. But that's the thing about being a pilot, she thought. Even when you're off duty, even when you're just another passenger, you never really stop being responsible for the safety of everyone who shares the sky with you. And sometimes that responsibility begins with a simple question echoing through a crowded cabin. Can anyone fly this plane? For Sarah Chin, the answer had always been yes. She just happened to be dozing in 7C when the world needed to hear it.